Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, now in this video, I want to talk about another issue for cluster B. Okay, so basically I've been talking about the issue of empathy and my alternative to empathy, which is just caring and just bearing the load of our environmental taxation. And then the issue of arrogance, where, instead of focusing on the arrogance, I focus less on the attitude and more on actually being truly humble, okay, by taking on, again, the load of our environmental taxation. Okay, so that's true humility. When you have true humility, who cares how people criticize your attitude because you're truly humble? You know what I mean? Here, I'd like to talk about a related issue, which is the issue of vulnerability. Okay, again, as always, okay, psychology and their emotionality bias. Okay, they're going to look at things like vulnerability and humility as being sort of an emotive state, sort of a performance, and I call it a performance because it's just an emotional state. It's not really an actual condition. Okay, in other words, what does it mean to be vulnerable emotionally versus actually being vulnerable? Okay, now think about that. Okay, like actual vulnerability is when you don't know where your next paycheck's coming from. Okay, actual vulnerability is I don't know if I can pay my rent. Okay, actual vulnerability is I'm going to have trouble buying food. That's vulnerability. Okay, vulnerability is when you live in such a dangerous neighborhood, you don't know if you can safely walk to the convenience store. That's vulnerability. Okay, or you don't know if your parents is or your father's going to beat you up. That's vulnerability. So I think it's very important to understand emotional vulnerability, but also to understand actual vulnerability. Okay, now I would propose an alternative. Just like I'm proposing an alternative to the emotional empathy and to the emotional humility. You know, I'm proposing an alternative to so-called vulnerability, which is, apparently that's kind of like the fountain of youth. That's sort of like the ideal state, for a typical therapist. And I propose an alternative because I think these are just buzzwords, and I think that these really are, really we're wasting. I'm sorry, you can just try my ideas. I'm obviously speaking from an alternative, but I really think that just being emotionally vulnerable, it does not by itself give us much. Okay, I really, it might be somewhat valuable, but I think there are more valuable things for people with cluster B. Okay, and I personally, I don't think there's any prize for just being vulnerable, to be honest. I mean, except, you could say a person who learns how to be vulnerable can learn to not be so defensive. Okay, now that I will grant. Okay, and I'm not going to say that's not true. Okay, so I'll admit that. Okay, but I also think that we need to go a little further than that. I mean, it should just be step zero to not be defensive. I mean, we should all commit ourselves to be in a place where we're not defensive. But then, where more do we want to go? How further do we want to take it? Is it enough just to be vulnerable? I don't think so. So I propose an alternative to vulnerability, which is something that I haven't heard a lot lately, but something that comes from my childhood. I grew up in the 1970s. Okay, and one of the big values in the 1970s when I was growing up was sportsmanship. Okay, sportsmanship and being sporty. You know, now, why are these such important terms? Well, I think the sporty attitude is very underappreciated these days. Okay, being sporty, because sporty is the combination of having fun, okay, but also taking the hits. You see what I'm saying? Taking the hits of life. You know, I think there's almost nothing better spiritually than as a young person going into football practice. Okay, I think football practice is kind of violent, but you learn to take a lot of hits. And maybe I don't agree with football as a sport, but I do agree with football in the spirituality of it, in the sense that it's a symbol that reminds us that we can take a lot of punishment. You know, and we can also have fun and sort of combine having fun with taking punishment. I mean, it sounds kind of masochistic, but in real life, there's a lot of bruising out there. There's a lot of stress, and really taking on the burden of life. That really does load us down. And if we can summon a very kind of a sporty attitude about it, take on life as like a sport with a sporty attitude. I think that can be very helpful if we do it mindfully, if we do it responsibly. Okay, So, I just think it's interesting. There's got to be some peculiar bias in the psychological subculture that you never hear sports metaphors. Maybe they're too intellectual, they're too upper class, to be worried about sports. It's too that must be too plebeian, too that's too bourgeois, for the typical psychologist. But I think sports has a lot to offer us in terms of the attitude. And if there's any attitude that I would like to take inspiration from, it's not going to be just being a miserable, vulnerable, feeling person. I mean, yeah, we can have vulnerability in the sense of not being defensive, but should we also not aspire to have a more sporty attitude about life and about the punishment and the hits we take in life? Take hits with a more sporty attitude. So I just think that if we can be inspired by at least the spirituality of football practice, what it's like to play hardcore American football, you know, maybe we could take that as sort of like a poetic inspiration, or spiritual inspiration to be a little more sporty in the contact sport of just living, and just taking on the burdens of our environmental taxation. Okay, so I really do encourage people to not just get cornered into all the ideal attributes in the psychology world, but also to look into the world of sports. Okay, and along with sportiness is sportsmanship. Okay, and what is sportsmanship? Sportsmanship is something I see so absent and so much missing in the world today. Um, and to me, sportsmanship is such a simple word, but it encapsulates so much graciousness. It's really graciousness is what it really is, sportsmanship. And that is, just being able to win or lose in a dignified manner. Not being a gloating winner or a sore loser. You know, and having a certain kind of respect for the opponent. You know, so I really think that sportsmanship is a very valuable attitude, along with being sporty. You know, and as we talk about humility, it's interesting how you can combine something like being truly humble, like really taking the load of our lives, and doing it with a sporty attitude, so we're actually having fun. So I really encourage people to look to sports and not to just get cornered into this lugubrious, kind of almost depressing world of the psychologist, which is like, you're in heaven just by being vulnerable. I mean, yeah, vulnerability, we should see that as a way of breaking through our defensiveness, okay? But just being vulnerable by itself is not a glorious, great place to be. And I think we need to look towards, aspire to not to a narcissistic, fantasy the narcissistic fantasy is going to be this kind of almost like a false glory. And I'm not talking about a false glory. I'm talking about actually finding I would say, the nobility of the best of the human spirit, which is not just being vulnerable. Okay, I think we can actually go out there and take the burdens of life and really take on the load, of our environmental taxation, and we can do it in a sporty way, and we can find the noble version of the conquest of life, which is not the narcissistic fantasy, but actually delivering ourselves to the actual taxation of life and doing it in a very noble, exalted way in the best sense of the word of exaltation. Okay, so I hope this doesn't sound narcissistic, because I really think this is not narcissistic. I think this is just truly earnestly seeking the most noble and the most, I guess, the most exalted in the true sense way that we can make the most of ourselves. Okay, because I don't think the end goal for our lives is just to be humble and just to be vulnerable. I mean, again, in the sense of not being defensive, I understand that. We don't want to be defensive, but we're not just going to stop because we're not defensive. I think there's more to life, and I really encourage people to look towards sports as an inspiration for finding some of those vitamins to make the best of us. And I think sportsmanship and sportiness, I think in those two attitudes, I think we can find some very good vitamins to help us go beyond just being vulnerable. So for that, and thanks for watching.